You are listening to the 5 a.m. podcast, and today is your day.
Welcome to the 5 a.m. podcast, where we bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders and influencers who are making headway and those waves in their callings and industries. Today, we are excited to be joined by a remarkable leader who exemplifies what it means to lead with purpose and heart. Marcylle Combs is a dynamic entrepreneur who's transformed a small healthcare agency into a multi-million-dollar healthcare enterprise spanning 3 states and having over 1,200 employees, all before selling it in 2018. Now, that was just the beginning of her journey. Now, friends, I'm going to ask that you share this with 3 of your friends who you know are going to enjoy this conversation. We thank you for being here. So come on in, have a seat, and listen in. I know many are going to enjoy this conversation. And I do want to say a quick thanks to those who've given us a 5-star review on their favorite podcast player. And of course, those that have gone over to buymeacoffee.com/5am podcast and bought us a few cups of coffee this week and last. We do appreciate your support. Now, here's that intro. Marcylle, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here today to share your wisdom and experiences with us. Welcome to the 5 a.m. podcast.
Well, I'm so honored and blessed to be here.
We're going to have a great conversation. It's going to be hard to keep this between 25 to 30 minutes, but that's the time we have allotted for
That's
today.
right.
So we will be good stewards of this time, and I know we'll be a blessing to those listening in. You built a healthcare organization from just a small agency. You went from maybe no employees to 1,200 employees. Was there a pivotal moment when you realized that the scale of what you were actually creating?
You know, I would love to tell you that I had set out 5-year goals, 10-year
Yes.
goals, and said, we're going to get from here to here on this, but that would be an absolute falsehood.
Okay.
I went to work for a little agency. I did home health and hospice.
Okay.
And I fell in love with the work. My number one goal was to be the best, first to be the best in that town, and then truly to spread that. And it was through and maybe I bore easily too, but it was through that and through an amazing team of people that we grew at that level.
Yeah, and those teams around us are just so integral. And you have that upcoming book that challenges the conventional wisdom of never hire your friends. Can you share your friendship management approach and maybe how it's evolved over these 30 years in healthcare leadership?
Do you know it's titled Never Hire Your Friends. I'll hold it up because I
Yes.
just happen to have a copy. But the never is marked out and it means always hire your friends. I think I came to a realization in the first couple years because conventional wisdom, even today, would tell you don't do that. But I beg to differ. And I thought we spend of our lives 70% of our lives at work. And why do you want to go to a workplace where you don't enjoy the people you work with or you don't like the people you hire? And early on, once I realized I was going to actually be working full time, took me a little slow on the uptake.
Yes.
It took me a little time to figure that out. I thought, you know what? I'm only going to hire people. Now, of course, there are certain job roles you
Right.
have to have, certain requirements for, but I'm only going to hire people that I like. And I'm going to do that with integrity and a set of guidelines. But, I figure they're their best on their first interview. And
Yes.
if they aren't very good, then what are they going to be in a year or 6 months or 2 weeks?
Yes.
So, the pillars of that are honor and humility and honesty. And you have to lead with those 3 things in mind if you're going to do this and do this well.
Yes. Well, those 3 pillars are they sound so integral to the whole process, but also to human character. Have you found over the years that you had an opportunity maybe to impact the next generation of workers, or even people in that they're not the next, they're the current generation, where you had time to disciple them at work?
Absolutely. One of my number one goals would be to help people achieve whatever their goal was, to help them, sometimes push them, drag them, encourage them, inspire them to maybe achieve more than what they thought was possible. And you have to have a plan to do that. Since as long as I can remember, picked some kind of leadership book, and part of our very regulated industry, where we had to teach lots of those topics, we always had 15 to 30 minutes to an hour dedicated to how do we lead? How do we behave? How do we handle situations? How do we become better? How do we become more emotionally intelligent? Over and over, you teach that, but then you also mentor that by helping people say, okay, how did you handle this situation? How could we improve that? Maybe I didn't really do anything wrong, but was there anything I could have done to get a different outcome? Even today, I mentor some people through a nonprofit, but I was just having the conversation. Maybe you did all the right things, but let's think about how you can improve what you did do right, because you
Yeah,
can't control other people. You can
that's
only
right.
control yourself.
Yes. Yeah, and in a recent conversation we had here on 5 a.m. podcast, I was chatting with the guest about correction happens in the moment, connection happens in the meeting. And I wanted to ask you about advocating for creating that friendship community in the workplace, and then still being able to balance accountability and performance, all while having that genuine connection. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think it becomes the hardest job and the best job. And I think it goes down to that pillar of honesty. I mean, some people consider themselves honest and they just erupt the truth, but it's not,
Uh-huh.
you don't care about the other person. If you have a
Right.
connection, I'll use your words.
Yes.
If you have a connection with that person, then it's going to make the receiving of that information, they're going to know that you care about them. And it is absolutely essential to have clearly, I mean, maybe, we get someone in orientation, we teach them it's a water hose
Hmm.
or a fire hose of
Yes.
information where you really need a trickle. So you have to go back and reiterate that information, but an employee should never just be surprised in their evaluation. You should be teaching them all the time. And it doesn't matter whether and I've hired, my best friend worked for me. In fact, I was so sad. She's a little older than me. So when she retired at 68, um, I was very sad. But I had to have those conversations of, you're handling this like this, and you have to do this. I've had people that have been my friends that I've had to terminate because they were just in the wrong seat and they wouldn't admit it. They couldn't get beyond, they didn't want to leave the
Mm-hmm.
relationship of the company,
Yeah. Right.
but they needed to go because it wasn't the right job. And it's hard. It is
Yeah.
hard. And I will say, even now, she went out and started her own business, and I utilized services
Oh,
from
that's
her.
great.
It took a little while,
Yes.
but
I bet.
I have to be honest to the business. So I
Yes.
have to be able to get to that situation. Especially, your goal is to get them to there, but sometimes they have to go.
Yeah. And when we think of that divine spiritual plan and know that it's not just the physical around
Right.
us, it's actually these delightful humans that have come into our sphere.
That's right.
And we get to say, you know what, this might not be your life goal, but it's your current goal. And
Right.
so how can we help you get beyond where
Right.
you actually need to be?
Right.
But I want to ask you, is there a most profound leadership lesson that maybe you learned that completely contradicts the business books out there?
I would say the whole premise of this, of having really good friends at work, is against everything that's taught. And because I can say I've done it, I've lived it, the calling is higher to do that. Gosh, I've made so many mistakes in my life. I've hired people that I shouldn't have hired. I
Yeah.
always hesitate to tell this story, but I hired someone who had murdered her husband. I did
Oh
not
my.
know she
Okay.
had murdered her husband. And I did not know in the state of Texas you could actually get your nursing license back once you had. Now, today, this has been 20 years ago, but
Gotcha.
I didn't follow the rules at first because I really liked her.
Yeah.
But I didn't follow the rules of what I should have asked her early in the interview before I offered employment. Now,
Yeah.
again, the laws have changed now to where hopefully that would never happen again because she's
Right.
been to federal penitentiary. I know, shocking,
Buried the
but the
headline.
lesson I learned there is I
Yes.
can't skip the necessary steps to getting over here. She came highly recommended, all the things.
Of course.
But it was, a bad situation, let's just say that.
I bet. Wow, and that's sometimes you don't see those freight trains coming because they turn
Right,
the light off and
right.
everything looks great, but you hear that train a coming, like Johnny Cash said. And well, thank the Lord he walked you through that experience, and now
Yes,
it was a teachable moment.
and I never did it out of order again. In fact, I actually assigned somebody else to make sure, because at the business at that time, there was a somebody else, to make
Right.
sure those things were checked off before they got to my office.
Yeah. So then, we'll dig a little deeper or focus a little bit more. I wanted to ask, like, so you're a business leader, you're a wife, you're a mother of five, you have some grandchildren, I'm sure.
Yes.
How do you approach that work-life integration rather than what we hear of the work-life balance?
It is work-life integration, and anyone who tries to do it otherwise these days,
Uh-huh.
they're in my opinion, they're not gonna succeed. They're gonna end up, they're gonna end up frustrated. I think it's all and I mean, there's so many facets to that. I went to work so I have 4 sons, 2 years apart, and then 8 years later, I have a daughter. But it was all about, 1, knowing I couldn't do everything. And I am a person of faith, and so I didn't really when I first started when I was first in this position financially, I needed to be, but I thought if I just work 6 months full time, then I can go back to part-time and we would be so much better off. I always say
Right.
this, and now I say 40 years later, I've still not gone back
Famous
to
last words.
working part time, but you have to have a system. And I would say, and I say this even about myself because my kids are all grown now, you have to have a system and a support system. And luckily, I had a significant other. I have a husband that I've been married to for a very long time. And even though our generation did not believe that the man should take the kids to the doctor, which these days, that's completely changed.
Yes.
It was a very unusual happening then. We had to divide up tasks. You have to know sometimes work wins and sometimes home wins. And
Yes.
that's true of even now because I have a grandson who's competing in a state track meet. So I had to move my whole schedule around Friday so I could go. Well, home is going to win then. There was
Yes.
nothing life threatening at work or anywhere, but I had to move my schedule so I could do that.
Right.
You have to be more organized when you have kids at home. You really, and I will say, you have to know what your no go was. I could miss soccer practice, but I couldn't miss the playoff game.
Right. Yeah.
I could miss maybe with softball and baseball, there's 40,000 games. I might can miss a game, but I couldn't miss the senior night for
That's right.
my child. For senior night for football for my second child. I got on an airplane. I was speaking at a conference, got on an airplane, took a cab from Dallas up to Denton, and which is about an hour away, and changed literally in the bathroom really quick, put on my stuff, got back, walked across the field with him, got back in a cab, went back to the airport, changed back into my garb again, went back to the conference. But one of my no goes, and that's not to say Marcylle is the greatest person in the world, but it was one of my things of you can miss these things, but you cannot miss this. There won't be another one of these that I can't be there. And that was just because of the work I did.
Right.
You know, you own your own business, got a lot of people depending on you, but those little people at home,
Yes,
they're going to be out the door.
that's right. And so, listeners, I'll ask you, put something in the comments about priorities and that work-life integration, and maybe comment on a time where you were able to put the brakes on and say, no, I've got to remember my priorities. And, the water under the bridge, that might be, but there comes a time where you have to stop on the bridge and take stock of what's there.
Right.
And so I wanted to ask you then, Marcylle, and maybe I don't think you've answered this one completely, but what's maybe the most challenging aspect of, we've talked about the let's say family management, the friendship management, and then the navigating situations maybe where there was either a family or a friendship conflict with the business and you kind of had to work some personality in there.
I think the most challenging time, it's hard to say because there's been so
Uh-huh.
many, like any business, so many challenges. We got to a situation, we were a government contractor, if you will, because
Gotcha.
90% of our income came from them. And we took a $2 million cut, and even to I think we were probably around 50 million then, a $2 million cut that happens, they let you know in about 2 weeks before it really happens. If you want to get down, some ways it might be four. We had to do a layoff, and to terminate, we cut a whole entire department. And to terminate people who are your friends, some were my friends before they came to work, others were after, due to no reason of theirs. That was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And I've done some pretty hard things, but that's probably all we have time to do. But that was
Yeah.
very difficult. It was very difficult to have those conversations because, depending upon their emotional intelligence, some of them didn't understand why it had to be them and not another department. Now we did it in my mind. I could go to bed and put my head on the pillow, but we called it the terrible awful. It was a terrible awful time, and as a company, we lost a few employees after that because they they didn't, even though they knew it in their head, they didn't know it in their heart.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a tough needle to thread
Uh-huh.
in that sense. So I still have a few more questions that I've got to ask you, but before we do that, there might be some people that want to surf the web over to find out more about you. So how can they get in touch with you?
They can go to my website, which is marcyllecombs.com. And if they need to pay attention to how it's spelt in your
Right.
podcast,
Yes.
because if they get the name wrong, they'll get the website wrong.
Okay.
I also have a podcast directed toward women in leadership called 50% with Marcylle Combs. Again, tie that or key that into your podcast app. It'll come up as long as you get my name spelled right.
Right. And we'll put that on the screen too, so there's no discrepancies there. I
Okay.
wanted to ask about that next generation because it seems like everything that you were doing was actually for the person who was in your orbit. And so that means that you're looking at the now and you're looking at the past and the future. So based on your experience mentoring and coaching, what do you see as the greatest strength and maybe the greatest blind spot for today's emerging leadership?
Well, there's so many greatest things about this generation, but let me start with the one I think is the number one blind spot. And I believe we've created this somewhat to ourselves. Partially, it is stress versus anxiety. And it is, we live in a world where there's instantaneous information. And probably 80% of the instantaneous information we have is incorrect. For let's take Gen Z, and I talk a lot about Gen Z and millennials. And look at the things that they've had to go through. We went through a pandemic of 2020. Never in my lifetime did the whole world shut down. In fact, my father, who's now in heaven, he died 3 years ago, but he said, Marcylle, it's going to get mean out there. So they've seen a world that has just stopped. And really, frankly, due to movies, a lot of them believe we're going to get a virus and they're all going to turn into zombies that eat us all. But
Yes.
but they have, rightly so, and they have seen school shootings. They have seen all this junk. So they have unrealized anxiety due to facts, but some untruths. So when I see them, they tell me they have anxiety, and many of them tell me they've been given medication at 16, 15. And I'm not saying that is the incorrect thing to do
Right.
if you have good counsel with that. But some of it's just, I had a flat tire this week, so I can't go to class. I'm in college. I can't go to class all week because I had a flat tire and I got to figure out this flat tire. That's just normal everyday stress. So I feel some of the coaching has to do with how do I distinguish what's just everyday stress. This is just, I have 2 kids, I'm divorced, they're little, and I got a full-time job, and daddy doesn't pay child support. Now, I want to ring him up by the
Of course.
closest tree. But, that's her everyday stress.
Yeah.
Anxiety might be one of them gets sick and has leukemia.
Yeah.
You know, I it's helping them decide how do I cope with everyday stress and how does that prepare me for real true anxiety. And I will say many things that I would have taken in stride they're all worried about. They're worried about their degrees. They're worried about, I'm like, just pick one because really, probably 20 years from now, you're not going to be doing that.
That's true.
So just make a decision, get a trade, do something,
Yeah.
quit worrying about it and take action. That's the number one thing from a general perspective. So if I have a chance to talk to them,
Yes.
one great thing about being a grandmother is I get put in an other category.
Yes.
I'm not the parent. I get to be other. And
Yes.
so they kind of take my words a little more as wisdom. The bright spots about this generation, oh my gosh, they are natives when it comes to anything electronic. They know how to work it. They intuitively know how to figure it out. Brilliant kids, entrepreneurs, so many bright spots. And that's their big advantage, if you ask me,
Yeah.
and what they do and how they understand the world.
I love it. That's great. And I was having a conversation yesterday with Dr. Sabrin from the Mises Institute, and he was talking about the joy he had as a professor of speaking into young hearts and minds. And I want to switch a little bit as we're getting close to wrapping things up, but I do know that you've been on a lot of missions trips. And yes, that's what I discovered in my research. So could you share maybe a story from your time on a mission trip that fundamentally maybe pushed the brake pedal and changed how you viewed a leadership or business?
Now, let me just say this in full honesty. I used to believe that some people were called to go and some people were called to give.
Yes.
And
Right.
unfortunately, one year, because we had a nonprofit and we did this kind of thing through the nonprofit, someone got typhus and they were teaching this class, and I was the only one last minute that could go. And the truth is, the head of this group had really been praying that I
Okay.
would go, which is unfair because I am a creature comfort
Yeah.
girl. But we helped, and let me say this because I'm so proud of this work. I went, I don't even know how many times, but for 9 years we went to Belize and we helped them develop their hospice there with no funding, only volunteers, doctor led teams, because those were only the ones with cars. We helped them take their standards for hospice to the Ministry of Health and got passed. So I'm very proud of that work. But let me just say, I didn't want to go. So if you're listening to this and you don't want to go, don't let anyone pray about it. But what I learned is people who are sick and suffering and people who are providing that care, those people are the same the world over. Their circumstances are different. And I will say, when I would come back, it was a hard time for me to come back because we're always complaining about reimbursement, raises, cost of living. Those people were doing it all on their own. I mean, they would work all day long and then they would go see patients after hours on the weekend, on their time off. Such a tremendous work. I've never been so hot in my ever loving life. Let's just say I really appreciate refrigerated air and who developed that and how
Right.
well it works.
Yes.
So
Oh,
there's my shallow answer to go with
that's
my
great.
deep answer.
That's great. Now, just before we wrap up, I want to ask you, did you have a most influential mentor in your life?
Do you know, I have a lot. Probably my most influential business mentor was the guy I bought the business from, and he was not the easiest person in the world to work for, but he challenged me. Like he said to me, "Here's this little bitty nurse who thinks that at that time nobody was making over 50,000 a year. Who
Right.
said he said, 'What is your goal?' And I said, 'Well, to be the highest paid nurse in the United States. I don't know if I've still done that, but to make $100,000 a year and to have $6 million cash in the bank.'" You know what he said to me? Not what
Tell-
all my friends said to me. He said, "That's not near enough, Marcylle." And I thought to myself, what that said to me was, you can achieve anything. You can achieve anything. My most influential leader, and I have to give him a shout out because he wrote the foreword for my book, is John Maxwell. I've read more of his books, taught more of his books than I can imagine. And then, really, one of my very best friends, Janelle Henry, who was always spiritually about 10 feet ahead of me. I can
Nice.
never really catch up, which is really a really good thing for me. Someone who brought me back to mind of, have you really prayed about this? Have you thought about this? Do you have that answer? So those three people, huge influence. And
Wonderful.
so many others, really, so
Of
many
course.
others, but
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's great insight. And ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Be sure to check out Success with Marcylle Combs and MarcyLleCombs.com. There's a menu on the right, and that will get you into some great resources where you can continue your journey looking through Marcylle's great work and great information. And of course, check out her podcast as well. So, Marcylle, thank you so much for joining me today for the 5am podcast.
thank you, Michael. It's such a blessing to be on here.
I loved it. It was a great conversation. And you try and keep these things within a digestible window of time, but it's just like we got to have 37 parts to a conversation because there's
That's
just,
right.
we need to be know fully and be fully known one day. And
That's
so,
right.
Marcylle, thanks so much. It was great. And viewers, thank you too. We appreciate you being here. As I often say, it's kind of like Marcylle and I are sitting in a diner having a nice, I don't know, a breakfast or a cup of coffee or something. And as you do when you're in a diner, you eavesdrop on the people behind us, and you've been eavesdropping, and we say thanks. Thank you. If you haven't already, help us grow 5am podcast. Share this with just 3 of your friends. I'm not going to ask for 4 because that's a little much, but I think 3 would be great. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for the 5-star reviews. Thanks for the Buy Me a Coffee visits. We do appreciate all the support. So until next time, Please seize your day, enjoy those sunrises and sunsets, and love the people around you. I'm Michael Klassen.